class. So this week we're covering Chapter 12, Survey Research. So survey research is based on asking respondents a series of questions and gathering information about their opinions, behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. So when using non-experimental design, survey research does not involve any manipulation of the independent variable by the researcher. So the researcher does not have to manipulate the independent variable when they use a survey design in the non-experimental research design. With survey research, this type of research can use both probability and non-probability sampling. The scope of the study can vary from data collection on a wide range of subjects to a more narrowly focused survey instrument. So here are some sources of errors affecting the survey research. Errors in survey research may occur because the researchers are surveying a sample instead of conducting a census. So a census involves collecting data from everyone in a population. One way to reduce your error is to increase your sample size. There are two categories of sampling errors. We have random errors and systematic errors. Random errors result in chance variations in individual responses around the actual or true values of what is observed for the group. It contributes to variability. So differences in the range of responses and standard deviations between the samples indicate variability between the groups. Bias introduced by random error is addressed by using the average of those repeating observations as an estimate of the true value. Systematic error, also known as systematic bias, this is consistent repeatable error that is associated with faulty measurement instruments or flawed procedures for data collection. Coverage error occurs when the researcher does not have the complete list of names in a sampling frame. It leads to differences between the sampling frame and the population. It leads to a non-representative sample and a biased result. This can be reduced by having a complete list of individuals in the sampling frame. Measurement error is associated with the observation itself. So using unclear phases of items, unfamiliar words or phrases, irrelevant terms in a survey, or it can also be by the interaction between the interviewer and respondents. So these are some of the contributing aspects of the measurement that can also lead to measurement error. Researchers should seek feedback from the potential respondents and survey area experts in early stages of the survey development so that they can create a clear and concise list of questions for the survey. Non-response error occurs when all prospective respondents do not respond to the survey. It also occurs when there is a non-response to specific questions, so it limits generalizability. So for example, if there's 10 questions on a survey, but people only filled out 7 or some only filled out 5, or those questions that were not answered will also create a non-response error. To decrease this error, we need to follow up with those who did not respond. So in designing your survey, you have to think about the purpose, right? What is your purpose? What's the statement of purpose? What information should be addressed? So the first step is to consider what information or data the survey needs to address. What is the study's aims? What specific questions does it intend to answer? A survey can have multiple purposes, so the purpose informs all stages of the survey design process. When thinking about how often the survey should be administered, that will depend on the survey design. So with a cross-sectional survey design, this is administered at one point in time. So this design does not allow you to assess changes in any of the construct of interest. With the longitudinal survey design, this is administered at multiple points in time. So a literature review can determine if measures exist in the literature that can be used to collect data. When conducting your literature review, this is done based on the survey's purpose. It is also guided by your research questions. So you would complete your literature review after you know what your research questions are. It helps determine what needs to be included in the study It determines measures to collect data. So it helps you determine whether measures already exist that you can use or whether you need to develop your own. For your literature review, you can use print, online, or electronic sources. So there's so many different sources that you can use for that. Based on the existing literature and the study's purpose, the researchers then develop a survey outline, identifying topics covered in each section. So the outline helps identify the specifications of the data collection strategy. So either use instruments from existing literature or create your own. All right, sequencing of questions. So there are different types of questions. We have open-ended questions that require responses in the participant's own words. Data need to be coded to be analyzed, which may be time consuming. Closed-ended questions have a list of responses to choose from. So they are already coded, and these are like the 5-point Likert scale. So when designing your survey, you will determine if you're using open-ended questions, closed-ended questions, or a mixture of both. With your group survey design, most of your questions should be closed-ended. I think you should only have 2 questions that are closed-ended. So you also need to consider the order of your questions. The first question should make the respondent want to complete the survey. The goal is when your respondent reads the question, they want to continue the survey and not just stop. Order should not influence how subsequent questions are interpreted. Make sure respondents are knowledgeable about the topic. So make sure that the questions that you're asking, you have to consider your sample. You have to consider who you're asking these questions to and make sure they know the answers to these questions. Avoid asking knowledge questions before your attitude questions. Put sensitive questions, if you have any, in the middle, and questions on demographics or background information at the end of the survey. Ask separate and open-ended questions on ethnic background and racial background. So as you're thinking about questions on your survey design, make sure you think about these things. Make sure you ask what their ethnicity is and also ask what their race is. So a lot of times people combine the question and says, what is your race ethnicity? If it's an open-ended question, and if it's a closed-ended question, they still combine it. Sometimes it's challenging to select just a one answer, or if it's combined, it's also challenging. So race and ethnicity are 2 different things and they should be separated. For example, when people look at me, they just assume I'm an African American. If you have that on the list as if you put what is race ethnicity in one question, I would have to select African American if that's the only option. If I'm giving the option of a race plus an ethnicity, I can select my ethnicity because my ethnicity is different than my race. My ethnicity would be Hispanic and my race would be Black. However, if you're limiting your participants to a specific response, it's hard for the respondents to be able to choose an answer that really fits, that really fits them. So those should be 2 separate responses. So some general guidelines for developing items. Clarity and specificity are critical. So it's really important that your questions are very clear and that they're very specific. So again, don't leave room for them to misinterpret what you're asking. It needs to be very specific, very clear. Use simple, clear language that, they can understand. Avoid professional jargon, vague terminology, and abbreviation. Not everyone knows all the abbreviations, right? So don't abbreviate things. You need to spell it out. Don't use professional jargon like who's your sample. If your sample if they're not going to understand what that means, then don't include that. You have to consider who's your respondents, who's going to be answering those questions. Use terms that are commonly used by the respondents. So make sure it's things that they're familiar with, that they use all the time. Response items should be as comprehensive as possible. So the response, if you are providing closed-ended questions that have specific responses, they should be comprehensive as possible. If there is no suitable category to choose from, respondents should have an option to write in a response. So even when you use closed-ended questions and you provide the responses, you should also provide an option that says other and leave a space for respondents to be able to fill in their response. The researcher must be clear about when the categories are mutually exclusive. So it's important that they clarify that. Some things that you should avoid double-barreled questions. That's asking multiple questions in one single question. So be careful that your question is just one question. Sometimes people do double-barreled questions. So basically there's two questions in one. And then as the respondent, you read it and you're like, okay, which answer should I provide? Because they're two separate questions. So there's two separate answers. So be careful when you're writing your question that they're just one. Avoid biased or offensive language. So be aware of language that people may find biased or offensive. So for example, a lot of times we may only use one gender. For example, we might say he or we might say she, but it's always important that instead of just using one, that we include all. So it's better to just say they. That way we're including everyone. You need to consult the groups to be surveyed. So consult like gender variant communities or groups that you plan to survey regarding the construction of the survey items or instructions. So when developing your survey, you also want to consult with people from that community. So send out your survey to them and have them provide feedback on your survey. There are assumptions about respondents' experiences and views. These assumptions underlie each survey item. So knowing this is important when asking about sensitive issues such as reproductive health. When developing questions, you must be aware of the person's cultural point of view underlying those words and phrases that you're using. So be careful that you're aware of the sample's culture as you're developing those questions. Response biases need to be considered. So social desirability. So when you have controversial questions on behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and situations where the responses are not anonymous, this may elicit socially acceptable responses. So you have to be careful that if you are collecting data that's controversial, that you consider that if it's not collected anonymously, that people are just going to respond in a way that they believe that that's just considered socially acceptable. So a good fix for this is to collect your data anonymously, and this would help that situation. In groups where social norms emphasize being polite or not challenging authority, people may tend to respond in a positive manner, regardless of the question that you ask. Using multiple items to measure the same variable may help this situation. It's always a good idea to pilot test your survey if it's a new survey. You would do this by administering your survey to a small sample of the population so that you can get feedback about questions and the instructions, the sequencing of the questions, and the amount of time taken to complete the survey. So it's always a good idea to send it out to a small group of people that are potential people that would be in the sample. So you would, for example, if you were looking to survey college students in the social work department, once you develop your survey, you would send it out to a small group. So not the entire social work body. You would probably just pick one class and send it to them and have them complete the survey so that they can provide you feedback on those specific things like the sequencing of the questions, whether the instructions are clear enough, how much time did it take them, and any other feedback that they would provide on the cultural or sensitivity of, issues of the questions on the survey. You also want to ask respondents to say if they think a question will not be answered and why, if any questions should be modified and how, if they have any additional questions that they recommend, and their reasons for recommending those questions. So based on that pilot testing, you would then make modifications to the survey. So based on the feedback you get, you would revise your survey. You would then use information from the pilot data to finalize the survey. You would use descriptive statistics results to obtain estimates of reliability of the scales and the amount of variability in each responses of the items. You would use the information to identify items to be eliminated or modified. So not this semester, but next semester we might learn to do that. But there's a way that you would run descriptive statistics on the actual survey so that you can determine the reliability of the survey and whether you need to delete questions from the survey. Qualitative data provides information on how respondents experience the survey and in-depth information on what they're thinking while giving those responses. It also provides feedback on clarity of the items and the instructions. You want to make formatting changes to improve the aesthetics of the survey. So the appearance of the survey is also important in your survey design. So that's something to consider when designing your survey for the assignment for this class. So in the case of self-administered surveys, the individual does not receive any assistance to complete the survey. Interview surveys and telephone surveys are administered to the prospective respondents by trained personnel. So while deciding on the method of data collection, the researcher needs to consider several things. They need to think about the characteristics of the sample, the types of questions that they're asking, and the cost and time associated with administering the survey. A mailed survey is one that is mailed out to the prospective respondents. You should include a cover letter explaining the purpose of the survey. Do not mention the hypothesis that you're testing. Clearly state if there's any monetary incentive. The amount should be acceptable to the respondents for their participation and time, and it should not make them feel like they're being coerced to respond to the survey. Mention sponsors. Also make sure that you're outlining the ways that you will make sure that their information is completely confidential and anonymous. Mention timeframes for the completion and if any other surveys will be sent out to them. Along with the survey and cover letter, you should send 2 consent forms, one to be sent back and one for them to keep. A self-administered stamp envelope should be provided for them to return the completed survey. So the disadvantage of mailed surveys is that the researchers cannot ensure that the respondents actually completed the survey. They could have had somebody else completed it. So that's going to be one of your disadvantages in that method. Whenever you mail out surveys, anyone can complete it. The advantages with mailed surveys is that mailed surveys are more appropriate for gathering sensitive information than to do these in interview surveys. If persons are highly literate, they are preferable. So once you get the surveys back, each survey should be serially assigned an ID number, and the date of receipt should also be noted. Putting the date can help determine if any extraneous event affected how the respondents responded. Follow-up mailing. So another survey should be sent out 2 to 3 weeks after the original survey. This is an effective way of increasing your response rate. 2 follow-up mailings are also appropriate. Each should include the cover letter, the self-addressed stamp envelope, and the consent form on the survey. So it's also important that you follow up on those mail surveys because a lot of times people get surveys in the mail and they don't complete them, they throw them away, or they may want to complete it and they're like, I'll do it another day, and then they forget. So follow up is just a reminder if they wanted to complete it that they, oh yeah, I misplaced it, I don't know where it is. But once you resend it to them, they might go ahead and do it right then so they don't forget. In an interview survey, trained interviewers read questions to the respondents and they record the responses. There should be an interviewer training, and interviewers are trained not to respond in the affirmative or negative to any responses. It's really important that the interviewer ask the questions and record the responses, but they can't agree or disagree with the participants. They basically need to try to just write the responses without giving any indication that they, like the responses or don't like the responses, so that participants are being very honest about their responses. Before conducting interviews with potential respondents, interviewers role play administering the survey to their supervisors and they get feedback. They should only be allowed to interview respondents when the supervisors feel that they are ready to do so. When conducting the interview, you need to provide consent forms to sign before the interview and make sure you urge respondents to retain one for their records. You need to read the questions exactly as written to avoid any misinterpretation, and you want to record their responses verbatim. So you write down exactly what they said. Do not paraphrase. You can do that later on as you're writing up the results, but do not paraphrase. With interview responses, a lot of times those are like qualitative answers. You do want verbatim. You do want to include exactly what the participant says as you're writing up the results. The advantage of the interview surveys is that it is the preferred method for data collection from people who are not proficient in English or in the use of computers, and also from people who are not well educated. Because if the interviewer is asking the questions, they can follow up on clarification of a question or a response. The interviewer is the one recording the responses. So really, all that's asked of the participants is to just answer the questions. In a telephone survey, a trained interviewer conducts the interview via telephone. Informed consent should be obtained from the respondent before the conducting of the survey. With random digital dialing, respondents are selected via a random digit dialing, and the telephone numbers are generated at random. The process is used to select both landline and cell phone numbers. This method ensures that the sample has both listed and unlisted numbers, and it is used to produce a representative sample of residential households. The advantage of the telephone method is conducting telephone surveys is way cheaper than conducting interview surveys. So online surveys are those that are conducted via email or websites. The advantages is that we can reach a large number of prospective respondents. Administration is relatively inexpensive, and it's preferable if people are highly literate. The disadvantage is that individuals may think that the survey is spam mail. Online tools like SurveyMonkey is a free software that has survey templates, and it also allows customized surveys. Qualtrics is also a subscription software for designing surveys, collecting and analyzing data. So as a student, I believe you may have free access to Qualtrics. I know as instructors we do. I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that students may have access to that as well. The response rate should be calculated after the time for the administration of the survey is over. The response rate is obtained by dividing the number of the completed surveys by the number of surveys sent out and then multiplying the result by 100. 70% response rate is generally deemed acceptable. So researchers should determine if respondents are representative of the population, and they should assess if there's any differences between the respondents and the non-respondents on their demographic characteristics. Increasing the response rate is a way of reducing non-response bias, which occurs if there is significant difference between the respondents and the non-respondents. Contact your non-respondents and ask if they received the survey, and if not, offer to resend it and remind them of the due date. Avoid sending surveys during the holidays and the beginning and the end of a school year. So those are bad times to send surveys. People will not fill them out. Along with the survey, you need to include a stamped, self-addressed envelope for them to return the survey. You may also want to consider offering monetary incentives for completing the survey. Make sure that the survey is designed in a way that it will not take too much time to complete, and offer to share the results of the survey with respondents. So these are all ways that you can increase the response rates. So diversity and ethics is also important to consider in survey research. Ethical surveying means not violating the NASW Code of Ethics and professional codes. Researchers must make sure that they obtain informed consent from every single respondent. Assent from a child or an adolescent and informed consent from parents or guardians are also needed if you're surveying minors. If the interview is recorded, the respondent must be informed beforehand. So if you're planning on recording it, you need to make sure that people know that ahead of time. Do not record without letting them know they're being recorded. Keep ID numbers on a separate list from participants' names. You can also keep these in two separate locked file cabinets, which only the principal investigator has access to. If the survey results are to be shared, make sure that the data is presented in an aggregate form. That way, people can't actually figure out who the respondents are or who responded what. So basically, summarize the data so that people can't just know exactly who the respondents were. If survey results are to be disseminated or shared, the data should be presented in an aggregate manner. This helps with keeping the participants anonymous or the responses anonymous. File return surveys in a locked cabinet to which only principal investigator has access. So if you're receiving mailed surveys, make sure you file those in a locked cabinet and only the researcher should have access to it. Destroy all survey data according to the university's RIB specified timeline. Failure to do so may result in termination of employment or suspension of study. So make sure that you know what the rules are for maintaining your survey. I think I want to say for us it's 3 years. I would need to double check that, but I believe we have to maintain those for 3 years before we can get rid of those survey results. The survey should be translated into the respondent's language if they do not speak English. Measures should be compatible with the language and the culture to which it will be adopted. Translating original items, revising them, and producing another translation until equivalent items are obtained in both language. So you need to make sure that you are translating original items, revising them, and producing another translation until equivalent items are obtained in both languages. Decentering also allows wording to be modified when an awkward version is produced in the target language or concepts in the original wording are inappropriate, unknown, or lack an equivalent in the target language. It also allows for optimal method for producing culturally appropriate surveys because it does not assume that the survey in the original language is the authoritative version. It should not be used when translating standardized measures. So we've covered a chapter in measurement and we've covered survey research. So you should have everything you need to develop your group survey. And so hopefully you guys can get a start on that if you haven't already done so and get that completed so that you can send out to family and friends to complete. That way you can have some results to write up your presentation as well. All right, so I guess this brings us to the end of chapter 12.